Okay, it's my great privilege now to introduce our first conference keynote speaker, Emerita Professor Martha Crenshaw. Professor Crenshaw is Senior Fellow Emerita at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University, and also Professor Emerita of Government at Wesleyan University. A pioneer of terrorism studies, with her first scholarly article in the field appearing in 1972, she was a Guggenheim Fellow and is a corresponding Fellow of the British Academy. She's also received the Nevitt Sanford Award for Distinguished Scientific Contribution and the Jean Knutson Award for Service to the Society from the International Society of Political Psychology, where she was also a past president and counselor. Professor Crenshaw's recent publications include Rethinking Transnational Terrorism, an Integrated Approach, which is a 2020 United States Institute of Peace PeaceWorks report. She is a principal investigator with NSITE, which stands for National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education, a U.S. Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Amongst her many other roles, she was a principal investigator with START, which is a Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence at the University of Maryland from 2005 to 2017. And she currently directs the Mapping Militants Project, which traces the evolution of militant organizations and the interactions that develop amongst them. And I can tell you from having used the Mapping Militants Project myself, that it is the most astonishing resource and contribution to the field. So with that, an extremely warm welcome to you, Martha, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle, for such a very, very kind and flattering introduction. I'm not sure I can live up to it, but I will do my best. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak. It's a great honor. I'm looking at my screen and it says we have 100 participants. I think that's extremely impressive. So for all of you in Australia, I believe that it's November the 3rd. For me, in the central time zone of the United States, it is the evening of November the 2nd. So I do applaud your efforts in getting together so many people so efficiently in so many different time zones. So I chose as my topic sort of a comparison between what we call inspired terrorism and strategic terrorism. And I will explain more in due course about what I mean by that. But I first wanted to sort of say the way I got this idea of trying to make this comparison was from some talks given by officials at the Department of Homeland Security here in the US. And their point of view that was communicated quite clearly was that so-called inspired terrorism is the wave of the future. And since a lot of my work has focused on organizations, I thought, well, let me think this through, and what is the difference between inspired terrorism and what I call strategic terrorism. I'm very grateful to DHS for having supported my research for these many, many years, including support now for the Mapping Militants Project, and I appreciate the compliments about that website. But of course, I have to issue a disclaimer, which is that my views are my own and should not be interpreted as those of DHS at all. So I also thought of this in terms of trying to perhaps start a debate. And I think what you're going to find out is that I'm going to raise more questions that I'm going to answer. So I don't have a large empirical research project that I'm going to present to you and try to convince you that I have the right answer. Instead, I have a lot of questions that I hope you will all help me think through. So what follows is more of a thought exercise or an experiment as opposed to a real research report. So what I'm aiming for here is sort of preliminary conceptual models of different approaches to terrorism, different lenses through which we might approach and understand the phenomenon that we have in front of us now as it's developed since 9/11, and indeed as it developed before 9/11, since there was a long history of terrorism that predated the catastrophic events of that year. So I just want to pose a question at the outset to sort of keep in mind, and that I'll try to return to, which is that are these two models, as I call them, or conceptual frameworks, different approaches to the same problem, to the same set of phenomena, or are they really different types of terrorism or different types of political violence? And here I'm also reminded of the work of Graham Allison. For those of you who are political scientists or who took political science courses when you were younger, I think of Graham Allison's work on conceptual models of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here it's quite clear he's trying to explain the same thing, which was the outcome of this crisis, which was, as we've discovered in later years, a much more chancy affair than we originally thought. And it's clear that he's saying if you look at it from different perspectives, you get a very different idea about what happened, very, very different idea of the outcome. I also thought of an article that I wrote myself some time ago when I was first proposing organizational approaches to the study of terrorism, in which I compared and contrasted an organizational approach to what I then called, I think, because I did not actually go back and reread my article, a rational actor approach to terrorism. Again, I was choosing sort of almost polar opposites. So those are sort of some of my inspirations myself for embarking on this comparison. So let me just go through a kind of probably overly abstract comparison of these two approaches or models, and then turn again to a discussion of the implications, questions, and in particular, policy responses, implications for how government should deal with these phenomena. So, and again, I really am looking forward to questions, because I would be very happy to be challenged on my interpretations of the debate and what's going on. So when I think of inspired terrorism, what's called inspired terrorism now, which is a fairly new term, are acts of terrorism performed largely by individuals acting on their own initiative without specific direction or logistical support from others. Sometimes in this category, we have very small groups, a pair of brothers, a husband and a wife, a family, that is, people linked by sort of family ties rather than anything else. Now, strategic terrorism, on the other hand, I think of as acts of terrorism that are part of a broader campaign deliberately intended to influence governments with a very definitive outcome that's hoped for on the part of the decision makers. There is a strategic logic, there is instrumentality, and we can expect to see a very distinct connection among different attacks. Again, that's putting it more starkly, but for purposes of debate. So in each case, the key concepts are, in the case of inspired terrorism, extremism, violent beliefs, attitudes that justify violence, narratives, discourse. These are the key concepts that we work with. When it comes to strategic terrorism, the buzzword that's always been used is a thinking adversary, an adversary that is aiming at intimidation, at spoiling peace processes, at provocation, and a key concept is sort of a strategic interaction between the government as actor and a terrorist organization or extremist organization, if you will, violent organization as an actor. And it's sort of almost like a warfare. We come back to that later. In each case, the central actor or level of analysis is also different. I think of the individual as being the level of analysis when it comes to inspired terrorism. It's at the individual level of beliefs, attitudes, motivations, justifications, background, susceptibility. In the case of strategic terrorism, we're thinking of a group, an organization with a structure, with leaders, an entity that often, although not always, claims credit for actions in the name of the group, issues proclamations, justifications for the use of violence in the name of the group, selects targets, in other words, an organized entity. This would be your main level of analysis. Now, causes of inspired terrorism. Here, I think I put radicalization, in effect, change in attitudes on the part of individuals, their beliefs, their convictions, everything changes so as to make them think that violence is necessary, is justified, is even required or obliged by the belief system that they have adopted. We know that that this kind of psychological transformation, as we often think of it, can be something that happens very quickly in some cases. It happens very gradually, apparently, in other cases. But we regard these changes as the primary cause of violence. We could put socialization processes in that category as well. When it comes to the causes of strategic terrorism, like Graham Allison in explaining his rational actor model, I see that in effect, we see the cause as a conscious choice or decision on the part of the collectivity, the organization, the group. So on the one hand, attitudinal change, on the other hand, a very deliberate choice or decision. If we look at the processes by which outcomes are arrived at, the processes that lead to the outcomes, radicalization in the case of inspired terrorism, we see very much is brought about by social media. We were not as concerned with social media at all when it came to strategic terrorism. It plays a role, yes, but it's much more of a central role and a central point of concern for us as analysts, for government, as practitioners in the case of inspired terrorism. And in this world, very much influenced by communication via social media, propaganda by social media, I would say that figures that are somewhat like social influencers in a more peace-oriented or entertainment-oriented domain become extremely important to the process that leads to the outcome of violence. Because of course, the kind of communications that lead to violence don't come from nowhere. There is a source, and these sources are of a particular concern to us. But we understand that the process can be, if not accidental, very difficult to predict. And I'm reminded of a very recent case, just as an illustration, the case in France of the beheading of a school teacher, a teacher in a lycée, because of his discussion of the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, which were, we all know, enormously controversial. And as essentially the history of what happened emerged over time, the reports that I read recently were that one of the students in the class reported to her father on her interpretation of what had happened. And apparently her interpretation was not what other students in the class thought had happened. In other words, she may simply have been wrong. The father didn't pause to inquire as to whether it was right or wrong. He was extremely offended by her account. And he then reported this on social media. The message was then picked up by someone who had a great deal of influence via social media, already had a lot of followers. He picked up the story uncritically, and the result was someone acted on the story that was then reported as true via social media. It was enormously tragic, but it showed how a couple of individual perceptions were picked up by someone who already had an important role in social media and thus transmitted and then acted on, although no one except the actor himself, the perpetrator, had necessarily an intention of violence. when it comes to strategic terrorism, we think in terms of a process of decision-making. We're keenly interested in the decision-making in the group or organization. We think of it in terms of a calculation of costs and benefits. We think of it in terms of perceptions of opportunities and threats in the environment. We think of it as, again, a calculation. Here are the pros and cons of doing this or doing that. And again, let me just issue a reminder. I'm sort of exaggerating the differences between the two for purposes of argument at this point. Now I want to mention three things that seem even more tentative to me. My first ones are preliminary. These are super preliminary. And one has to do with the geographic focus or scope or origin of the threat. It seems to me that we're much more inclined to talk about inspired terrorism when we're talking about a domestic environment. And that here we have sort of two types of inspired terrorism, one being what in the parlance of US government officials they call homegrown terrorism, which means imported ideas, but homegrown adherents of perpetrators, and then domestic extremists whose intentions and ideas are primarily domestic, although there are foreign connections. And in this sense, we're concerned with how terrorism is inspired in what is largely a peaceful environment, in many cases a democratic environment. This may be a mistaken perception of what's going on or how we use these sorts of terms, how we think about it. So I'm just throwing that out there as a question, is this the case or not? Is this really sort of part of the hidden side of it? And when we talk about what I'm calling strategic terrorism, we're thinking of a foreign other, in some cases a very alien other. Now this dichotomy is clearly very blurred, but we're thinking of war zones, of conflict-ridden societies, of terrorism that is exported from those societies. And of course, we regard ourselves largely as the victims. This may not be the best interpretation, but I just wonder if this kind of underlying assumption is behind it. Then there's the notion of the targets of inspired versus strategic terrorism. Now, I think of the targets of inspired terrorism as very much targets of opportunity. They're almost always civilian. These attacks often aim at and cause large numbers of civilian casualties, churchgoers, children. There is apparently some predilection for churches, mosques, religious symbols, but at any rate, these targets are what we call soft targets. They are easy to access, and targeting them generates quite a large amount of publicity because the shock is so extreme. The environment, a church or a mosque, one of peace and tranquility, to be disturbed by violence. On the other hand, strategic terrorism has soft targets, certainly, and hard targets as well. There's quite a large literature on why they choose the targets that they do, but they're deliberately selected, and there's simply a wider range. The plots are more sophisticated. There's more delegation of tasks. The perpetrator isn't always or necessarily the same person who made the decision to commit the attack. They can be a delegate or an agent, as principal agent theory would tell us. Sometimes organizations have preoccupations with certain sets of targets. Al-Qaeda, for example, was and probably still is preoccupied with aviation targets. I'm not sure that we quite see this kind of choice of targets and ability to hit more difficult targets in the part of inspired terrorism. That then set me to thinking somewhat about weapons. Again, this is very, very tentative, but often with inspired terrorism, we see shootings, not always, but they involve firearms. Of course, there are cases of bombs, but and this is an empirical question that if I'd had time, I would have gone out and brought you some figures on the subject, but I've just wondered if it's the case that we're more likely to see firearms. In many cases, they're easier to acquire and easier to use. In the case of strategic terrorism, you see a greater range of weapons. You see the use of vehicles, for example, recently to mow down crowds of people. You see extensive and sophisticated use of bombs. You saw the extremely sophisticated 911 attacks, extremely innovative and enormously destructive use of violence. So again, those are just very tentative ideas set out there in terms of making this kind of distinction between the two approaches, the assumptions we make, what we look at. Then we come to the remedy, the prescription, the policy response to inspired versus strategic. Here, I find the distinction, I think, pretty clear, at least to me. In the case of inspired terrorism, we have countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism. There's a great deal of emphasis on community-based persuasion, targeted intervention with individuals who are thought to be susceptible or in danger. We have what in the US we call strategic communications to counter the propaganda that might mobilize people to act. We have the cultivation of societal resilience to the kind of messaging, the kind of appeals on the part of social media. We have an emphasis on rehabilitation, on creating off-ramps, one of those new terms, creating off-ramps for people who are on the path of radicalization. We stress de-radicalization, counter-radicalization, all these programs that are community-based and individual-based in order to, in effect, to affect attitudes and belief systems. When it comes to strategic terrorism, it's disruption, defeat, the use of military force, extensive reliance on intelligence, not to say that intelligence doesn't play a role also in trying to combat what we regard as inspired terrorism. There's an emphasis on sometimes surveillance, decapitation being a word that was frequently used, meaning removing the leaders of a group because you think of the leaders of an organization as being enormously important to the execution of violence. There's a belief certainly in among American military circles for a long time that removing the head of an organization would significantly disrupt activities. There's been an enormous debate over whether or not this really is the case, with very persuasive arguments actually on both sides here. There's an emphasis on coercion, an emphasis on ripping apart violent networks. And some people will say, well, that is in the terminology, it's just mowing the grass, they grow back. And other people say, no, you're really ripping them apart, they cannot regrow. And these responses can be pursued through military means. Obviously, this may be, well, I would like to say it's more of a thing of the past, but probably not. And of course, domestic law enforcement as well. Now we're concentrated on over the horizon military responses in the case of the US after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So what are some of the implications of the development and comparison of these two relatively abstract conceptual models? You know, the idea of sort of trying to talk about types of terrorism or different models of terrorism is actually quite old. This is, in effect, I'm returning now to the question that I mentioned in the introduction. Before 9/11, the most common dichotomy, I think, that you heard if you were an analyst of terrorism, before 9/11, I don't think we really talked very much about terrorism studies as a discipline or a subdiscipline or research area. It's only been since there was a great explosion of interest in the topic that I guess we gained enough heft to be the studies of something. But the classification scheme you usually heard about then was crime versus war. Is terrorism a form of crime? Is it a form of war? Again, very fervent debates on this subject. And it seems to me that that's really not irrelevant now, because when we think of approaches to domestic extremism, inspired terrorism that is domestic in origin, the approach usually is a criminal justice approach. It's within your own borders. That's the approach we use. And when terrorism emanates from outside, from these organized entities outside, we do think of it more as war. Now, let me say just parenthetically, this is not to say that many societies have not faced very well organized, very structured, purely domestic groups on their territory. We could name a number of states that have faced separatist groups, nationalist groups, far right groups that did not emanate from the outside and clearly usually had to be dealt with as crime. But you also saw states tempted to slide over into the military framework and to apply military power to combat even a group that was purely a domestic threat. Even before 9/11 and really with the advent of Hezbollah in Lebanon in the 1980s, itself a result of the Iranian Revolution, which was had a fundamental effect on the development of terrorism. Essentially, people began to talk about religious terrorism and the role of religion in terrorism. And religious and secular terrorism were considered by some people to be two very distinct categories. There's a very great interest in what is the effect of religion. As I'm sure you all know, a number of books were written on religion and violence. The dichotomy then, one of the dichotomies, in addition to religious, secular, and that kind of subsumed it, was new versus old terrorism. And as some of you probably know, I've written on that subject as well. And I was one of the people who was very critical of the distinction between new versus old terrorism. And I said that often the new terrorism proponents were misinterpreting what really happened with the old terrorism. A lot of the old terrorism was just as ruthless as the new terrorism. But the idea here, again, was we have a fundamentally new type of terrorism, the new terrorism. They are more fanatical, they are less calculating. I've said strategic terrorism, these are the calculating entities. I said, no, these are religious fanatics who they don't want a seat at the table. They simply want to destroy the table. Before 9/11, there were books written to this effect. And with 9/11, we found even more of an emphasis, I think, on new versus old, as Al-Qaeda being something totally new, totally different. Now is the new is inspired and old is strategic, perhaps. Is it something like the former new versus old dichotomy? I'm not sure. Is inspired more destructive than the new terrorism of old? All this begins to sort of lead one into something of a conceptual muddle about distinctions. And it leads me back to that question of, are we really dealing with different phenomena? Are we dealing simply with different approaches to the same set of events out there? Again, I'm going to leave that for the moment, and I'm going to proceed on to a few more questions in the time that I have, and I promise I'm going to leave time for questions. So one question we should say is, are these two approaches to terrorism compatible? How are they related to each other? Could we take them and merge them into a sort of single integrated framework for the analysis of terrorism or political violence? Do they sort of overlap? Is there a composite approach that would be better analytically, better in terms of responding to the threat? Can we combine? Can we integrate? And I think that the task of integration goes beyond simply a difference in levels of analysis, but that might be one way of trying to approach combining the two conceptual models. And again, I'm uncertain about this, and I hope that all of you brilliant minds out there, I now see we have 115 participants, can devote some thought to this. Should we really abandon this distinction and merge it all into a single framework? Now, what about the point of view of the adversary, the terrorist in this question? Well, actually, we know that even in its early days, Al-Qaeda considered what we might call inspired terrorism to be part of a strategy, that it could be part of a very deliberate strategy. An Al-Qaeda theorist named al-Suri wrote about this actually quite some time ago. And we know quite well that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and known as AQAP and the Islamic State, ISIS, had a very deliberate practice of trying to incorporate inspired terrorism into their overall strategy. And inspiration was a part of what they tried to do. We all know that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula published a magazine in English, no less, explaining how to make a bomb in your mother's pressure cooker, calling on its adherents to act in this kind of uncoordinated, almost chaotic fashion, sort of in a strict use of the term. We know, looking at the far right, that the concept of leaderless resistance is quite an old one. It's been around for quite a long time. That's a little less directed, but the idea was that in order to prevent the authorities from learning about what you're doing, you have leaderless resistance, so they find it harder to track you. Thus, in many ways, you could interpret, if we interpret some forms of inspired terrorism as parts of a strategy, is it really a sign of weakness on the part of the people who are calling for inspired terrorism rather than a sign of strength of the cause or of the motivation? Certainly, I think in terms of the Islamist jihadist groups that I've mentioned, it was a sign of weakness because they were having a very difficult time in implementing the strategy that they wanted of attacking the United States or US targets or Western targets abroad. Now, relying on inspiration of individuals in small groups, largely self-directed, uncoordinated, is actually doesn't make very good strategic sense, because most people think of a good strategy as depending on very clear lines of command and control. I mentioned principal agent theory earlier. We regard an organization that's efficient as one in which the leaders or principals control their agents or their subordinates. And we regard a loss of control over those subordinates as a sign of weakness. It leads to all kinds of unwanted attacks on targets that actually are detrimental to your cause. So it really seems to be a very unreliable sort of strategy, but we don't want to deny that it happens. It could be that such inspiration is due to weakness, due to the fact that strategic terrorism is blocked, could be a mechanism of plausible deniability on the part of the group. So it wasn't us who did it, AQAP or ISIS or whatever, don't punish us, don't retaliate against us. It was just someone acting on their own behalf, and we have no control over what people do. I'm not sure that well, that would be an empirical question. Does that work? Does it prevent retaliation? So now we know that not all inspiration is, of course, from entities who are deliberately seeking to inspire as part of a strategy. And we know that what I'm tempted to call a sort of more pure, more centered theory of inspired terrorism is when it's inspired simply by other individuals. And this is a sort of contagion or imitation effect. And we know that this is very strong in inspired terrorism. And I guess what I'm suggesting is, should we make another distinction here between this type of inspired terrorism so that an individual, say Breivik in Norway, does something outrageous in a way deliberately to inspire imitation, and it does. And as we know, this chain went on until the Christchurch attacks. Now the perpetrators are, communicating live with their audiences while they're communicating attacks in a very deliberate attempt to inspire inspiration. They're quite open about this. Is this a different form of, is this maybe what people mean when they talk about inspired terrorism, as opposed to the kind that there is an intent behind it? This is a case where simple awareness, communication of an action then inspires others to imitate. And let me say in passing, there's been over the years quite a lot of research on contagion processes, on what types of acts are contagious, which inspire imitation by others. I think that we've got a lot more material now, and we could certainly continue these lines of research as to when is there clearly no organized attempt to inspire, whether it's deliberate social media propaganda, or AQAP and their magazine on how to build bombs. Now, again, I talked about the foreign domestic dichotomy. This is related here. Is it really a very different sort of matter when you have a group outside a country deliberately calling for inspiration against a government, as opposed to groups inside a country or individual ones inside a country? But simply, I guess the overall point here is that the more you try to explore these things and you try to divide them into two categories, you discover there are even more categories out there, and it's even more complicated and complex, which of course comes as no surprise to all of you who are researching on the subject. Now, where does ideology, where does religion fit in? Are there certain ideologies, religions, belief systems that make people more prone to act on communications that call for violence? And here again, I don't have a good answer here. Are these beliefs, again, ideologies, religion, sources of vulnerability to certain types of extremist propaganda? In which case we need to go deeper when we're trying to deal with people's attitudes. For example, some people have found in past research that people who had very, very good religious knowledge were less susceptible to appeals to violence, because they knew, and it was people with less religious training, less of a deep religiosity, we might even say, who are more susceptible. And this, of course, bears some thinking about. We certainly try to use authority figures in different religions and different ideological currents to try to persuade what people we consider to be vulnerable not to go in that direction, or to de-radicalize after the fact. This leads to another question on my part, which again is a subject of some of your research, you now participants, where disinformation and conspiracy theories fit into all of this. Are they more prevalent in certain religions and ideologies? What sort of individuals are more prone to accept these kinds of theories, even very outlandish sorts of beliefs and conspiracy theories leading people, for example, to attack a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. And even after that was all exposed and the attacker was exposed as being diluted, let me say, some people still continue to believe. Apparently the pizza parlor still has people stopping by thinking they're part of a vast conspiracy. What about when conspiracies are deliberately promoted by organized actors? Are conspiracy theories, disinformation, more common in inspired terrorism? They have anything to do with strategic terrorism, except if promoting disinformation is part of your strategy. So we see again that inspired and strategic can sort of fit in together. I want to move on to policy responses very soon, but I do want to add a couple of observations. One is in recent years, there's been an emphasis on what is often called lone wolves, or sometimes called lone actors, as though the individuals who act physically seem to act largely individually. And therefore, I think that the stress on the individualism, the individual autonomy may be overdone, in the sense that in my own research, largely what I've found is that many of these individuals, although they were not connected in any kind of organizational or directive sense with others, did not think of themselves as acting alone or as acting only on their own behalf. The exception I can think of is the Unabomber, but otherwise, most of these individuals think of themselves as members of a larger collectivity, although there may be no real links there, no tangible links that you could identify and put your fingers on, simply because they think of themselves as part of a larger ideological or religious, if you will, whole or collectivity. They see themselves as part of a community, even though nobody has ever demonstrated to them that they're part of this community. There are no tangible signs, as I've said, of their being a member. It is simply a belief on their part that they are acting in the name of some sort of higher cause. And I think that has to be taken into account as well in our analysis of inspired terrorism and our focus on the individual as a level of analysis. Is the individual really thinking of himself or herself or them as alone and disconnected? No, I think that they feel, in effect, that by acting that they are becoming part of a community. They also apparently think that there will be an audience for their acts that will be approving. They wish to horrify, yes. They wish to frighten, yes. But I think they think that there is a wider community out there that will approve of what they do. And as I've said earlier, they, in many cases, aim to inspire imitation. And they think of themselves as attaining glory, immortality. Again, they, I think, believe that their act will be valued by a watching audience. And just slipping into response briefly, this is why now many government leaders, many press outlets refuse to identify people by name in their reports of these extremely violent actions, because they don't want to glorify the act. They won't wish to thwart this desire for immortality, this desire to cheat death, as some psychologists have told us. And this assumes in many ways that the reward that the perpetrator sees in the action is not so much political, but more emotional, more transcendental. And we certainly have to come to grips with this. Now, let me say, in concluding just this section, is really sort of an alarming ideological and somewhat bizarre ideological overlap, in that far right-wing accelerationists who think they want to provoke a race war or a social war, a widespread social conflict to bring down the government. So they're going to accelerate, in effect, the grand ending and governmental overthrow. Many of these groups and individuals supporting these groups support the Taliban and other sorts of anti-American or anti-establishment actors. And a common thread among some of these groups, jihadists, far right, is anti-Semitism. So what a very strange collection of ideological strands, ideological opponents. But we have to acknowledge that this is happening as well, that our ideological distinctions may be blurred in reality in terms of how people think of themselves and the kinds of allegiances and the kinds of allies that they're going to look for out there. It's really, really certainly alarming. So governments, the practitioner side, which we certainly don't want to forget and could not, can governments pursue both countering violent extremism, prevention, CVE, PVE, and what we call counterterrorism? One involves soft power, clearly soft power, I think, influence, and the other involves coercion, including the use of offensive military force. Now, again, that may be too rigid a distinction, but we're trying to perhaps oversimplify a bit to sort things out. Now, is it largely the case that most national governments have really followed two tracks with different purposes, different bureaucracies involved, different standards for the success of their policies and their efforts? I am inclined to think that this is the case, and certainly it is the case that where agencies that would normally be taking the forefront in, say, strengthening community resilience, these sorts of efforts, when they're asked to undertake activities such as reporting suspicious activities, there's quite a lot of argumentation and contentiousness. And I know I've been present at a lot of these arguments, for example, in Britain over their counterterrorism and countering extremism policies. Is it wise to have the agencies that are in your CVE field bleeding over, their activities bleeding over into the more punitive counterterrorism side? And then if it's the case that two-track approaches are extremely common, does this two-track approach just create more problems? I can understand the reasons for a two-track approach. There are lots of them. One is the distinctions that I've been discussing. The other is that government agencies, bureaucracies have different purposes in life. Again, this is an organizational theory, that they would want to pursue what they do and continue doing it. So I also suspect that proponents of very robust strategic response some may think that CVE is a waste of time, not necessarily harmful, but just irrelevant. So I want to conclude with asking sort of a question I began with about, can we merge these two approaches? Should the government response try to integrate these two approaches and come up with a unified policy, which we'd have to maybe call it something else? Or should there simply be two-track policies that try to strike a balance between the two? So I've asked questions rather than providing very many answers, but I will say in conclusion that it would be unwise to assume that we will only see inspired terrorism as we go toward the future. I think there are still strategic actors out there, and that we're still going to face a very complicated and very much dualistic sort of threat. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A in good time. So I'm not sure how the questions will be handled, but.
Thank you so much, Martha. That was absolutely riveting. I already have a heap of questions, and we see other questions that are coming in. Look, let me begin with one question here that goes directly to some of the issues and framings that you've offered around the relationship between inspired terrorism and strategic terrorism. So you've talked about the ways in which we need to, perhaps think about these in terms of different levels, right? So inspired terrorism at the level of individuals, strategic terrorism more at the level of groups and the relationships between state and non-state actors. But I'm wondering if there is also a way of thinking about this relationship that brings in a temporal dimension. And by a temporal dimension, I mean, I'm thinking, for example, of the ways in which you can see movements, for example, like QAnon, or some of the things that have happened recently around conspiracists, that actually would easily qualify as inspired terrorism. They begin as inspired terrorism, but they are then strategically exploited. Yeah, they're strategically exploited by allied movements or allied ideological formations or groups that say, actually, here's some fruit that's ripe for the strategic picking. So I'm just wondering what your response would be to thinking about how do we incorporate temporality, in such a model?
Well, I think that's a really very interesting thought, Michelle, that there could said to be stages, almost a ladder of escalation, to use strategic terminology, that again, you're right, that if there is inspired terrorism that is largely autonomous, dispersed, and groups take advantage of it and move in and try to scoop up these individuals whom they now know to be ripe, as you say, to be susceptible to recruitment, if, of course, they can identify these people. But I would say then here we're back to social media, and this is the way in which you then begin to pick up these people. So I think definitely that would be a thought. How would you incorporate that? I'm not sure that it would always be the case. I'm not sure that sometimes it would not go backwards. But I think definitely that would be an interesting dimension to try to bring into it. If we can imagine a sort of dichotomy framework that has 3 dimensions to it, I think that would be a very interesting addition. Why not?
Great, thank you. Let me move to some other questions that have now come up in the Q&A. The next question is asking for your thoughts on whether you see inspired terrorism as the product of rational actors, or what this participant is calling devoted actors.
Well, I think that's an interesting term, devoted actors. And I think my thought is both. That sounds kind of wishy-washy, but I think that, again, we know that there have been organized groups that have deliberately attempted to inspire individuals, motivate individuals to act on their own and to just do whatever they could do. They've been quite explicit about this. Whatever you can do as a contribution to the cause, which again removes people from the background who now could be considered to be likely recruits. But at the same time, we have people, we have inspiration that does not come from any kind of organized source and that appears almost to be accidental, as in the case of the French school teacher and the Mohammed cartoons. Again, the perpetrator is the responsible party, but there were a number of individuals back further down the chain who spread the kind of what turned out in effect to be disinformation that then inspired him. And so that was not a rational actor trying to inspire somebody to go do something. It, in many ways, sadly and tragically, it was almost an accidental sort of outcome of this series of misinformations that spread. So I would say that it's both, and that is an analytical and a practitioner task as well to distinguish between the two.
Absolutely. So another question here is asking for your thoughts on Rappaport's 4 waves of terrorism,
Mhm.
and specifically whether you see a new wave now taking shape more broadly in relation to the lone actor phenomenon.
Well, I think that David Rappaport just came up with a brilliant conception of waves, which are sort of ideological currents. If I can keep, stick with the oceanic analogies here, I do think that the idea of waves sometimes leads to the impression that one wave comes in, it recedes, another wave comes in, and then it recedes, when actually they overlap each other and the previous wave has not receded when the new one comes in. So in the end, you have quite a muddle out there. And so is there a new one of lone actor? In other words, is inspired terrorism a new wave? I think there's always been inspired terrorism. This is another, think of the anarchists very much along these lines. And their idea was that any act that opposed authority, that was anarchism. You were good. They were happy to adopt you. So the more outrageous the action, the better. They didn't care whether you were politically motivated, whether you belonged to an anarchist cell or not. So we've had this kind of individual lone actor, quote unquote, terrorism for quite some time. So I don't see it as entirely new. I think probably statistically we could show there may be more, and it's more destructive, I think, probably, and thus gets more of our attention and everyone's attention, and thus is more communicable because it gets the attention. It's this catch-22 sort of phenomenon. So I think we're seeing more of it, but not that it is entirely new at all.
So it's an interesting point that you're making about the communicable nature of it, because, and it's reminding me of Michael Stoll's work on terrorism as a communicative act. And in the end, whether it's inspired or strategic, the communicative impact is often the same, regardless regardless of which dimension it's happening in. The next question is focused again on the inspired versus strategic relationship. So this questioner is saying, look, the two seem conceptually distinct and of course broadly complementary, but not necessarily alternative models. So what value is there for us to perhaps no longer think about them as a dichotomy, but instead as the X and Y axes, of a kind of matrix where different forms and sources of terrorism can be plotted. For example, sophisticated versus unsophisticated attacks, etc. So your thoughts on, what do we stand to gain and lose if we abandon the dichotomy and start thinking more in these matrix terms?
Well, I'm very sympathetic with the idea of not thinking of it as a dichotomy. And in a way, I was sort of hitting off that kind of thinking, because if you take the logic of the dichotomy to its end, this is what you wind up with. And how do you bring them together? I had thought of the idea of a spectrum, but in fact, what we need is something like a multidimensional true typology. I have to say that often I'll read accounts and they say it's a typology, but it's not a typology for a social scientist in terms of a real distinctions between the different types, quote unquote. So I think the idea of some sort of multi-point plotting of where the act is in not just a spectrum, but in many more dimensions. The only question I would have, would this be so complicated and complex that only us academics would enjoy looking at it? We would be thrilled, of course, because we love complexity. It's what we deal with. But would it be too complex? And that gets us back to the big question, which is, it really is an enormously complex phenomenon. And all of us are forced to simplify it. Governments, in order to communicate, have to simplify it. And so how can we come up with a framework that can encompass this complexity without oversimplifying it? And I'm the first to say that's a terrific task ahead of us.
Okay, your focus on what governments need to do in terms of both conceptualizing and operationalizing responses to the problem that we're encountering here really goes directly to the next question, pardon me, which is asking whether you think inspired versus strategic terrorism requires different counterterrorism responses, and if so, where should we be focusing those counterterrorism efforts? If inspired terrorism is at least partly dependent, for example, on strategic terrorism in terms of justification, attack models, and so forth, will a counterterrorism focus that's dealing with strategic terrorism also indirectly counter inspired terrorism? Or instead, do we need a discrete and separate CT response for inspired terrorism itself?
Well, I will say that personally, I would like to work toward thinking of a merged or integrated approach, because I do think that the two are very closely related. So, for example, some counterterrorism measures that we're all quite familiar with have clearly alienated, aggrieved, angered individuals who then acted, who then were motivated to join groups or to act on their own in order to oppose governments who did such things. Communities feel singled out, they feel stigmatized often, even by benign measures, I might add. So you create an enormous number of problems. At the same time, we have to admit that a strategic defeat of a group like ISIS, removal of ISIS from power, from control over the caliphate, had an effect, I think, on people who might be inclined to be inspired, as we might say. It makes the group that you might identify with and act on behalf of on your own much less attractive as a cause that you could adhere to. They now appear not strong, but weak. So your robust counterterrorism policies could have an effect on whether or not people feel encouraged and motivated and inspired. Of course, it could have the opposite effect, and we need to know when it would, of saying, oh, my side is losing badly, I need to act to support them. I need to, in effect, to retaliate for what the government has done. And I think we need to explore these kinds of overlaps more. For example, would a foreign policy that focused more on human rights lead to less need for military counterterrorism? I'm not sure that I know, because I'm not sure we have any kind of evidence one way or the other. But perhaps we will at some point. Could there be changes in counterterrorism policy that would make countering extremism in the sense of prevention, societal resilience easier? And would it be a good idea for governments to at least discuss how this might? Again, this is more impressionistic than evidence-based, but I get the impression that different bureaucracies and governments talk past each other, and each is doing its job as it thinks it should, and perhaps as it should, as we expect it to, but it's not been brought together. And perhaps that's because problems come along, threats, and they're so pressing. You don't have time to sit back and spend a year thinking, how could we reorganize ourselves? It's very difficult to reorganize even a very small bureaucracy, never mind the whole CT apparatus of governments. So I would like to see more discussion of the possibilities of an integrated approach.
Okay. Coming back now to some of your comments on social media, this question is asking whether you think that social media platforms are now the primary means by which inspired terrorism evolves, Ooh, sorry, that question has actually just disappeared from
Oops.
the screen. No, let me see if I can reconstruct it from memory. Do you think that that Inspire Terrorism on social media, as it evolves into strategic terrorism? So first of all, is that a major pathway in terms of the evolution to strategic terrorism? And if so, does this offer opportunities for interdiction and response on social media as a kind of early warning sign? So it's quite an operational question.
I certainly think that I do think that social media is sort of an interlining. People who've ever sewed clothes know that you put sometimes a sort of stiffening sort of fabric in between two layers of fabric, and social media sort of plays that role. I actually used to do that in the old days when I had more leisure. Before I retired, I got extremely busy. But that social media does provide the connective tissue here, and that governments do need to regulate social media. If I may leap into that acrimonious debate, there needs to be better regulation of social media in terms of its connections to all sorts of violence, not just terrorism. But how to regulate it without infringing on free speech, and how to regulate it in terms of government being as persuasive as its opponents. We know that, for example, in the US, attempts at strategic communication to dissuade people have often been regarded as extremely clumsy and indeed counterproductive. We have simply not always been very good at it. I'm not passing judgment myself. I think the effort is, well conceived to try it, but we need to do better in terms of a role of the anti-inspiration. Combating this, we need to, our preventing violent extremism policies need to take advantage more of the way in which everybody else communicates. And we know that social media is useful for recruitment, it's useful for raising money, it's useful for spreading the message. It's also a source of weakness because government may not be able to communicate very well, but it can infiltrate pretty well. And as we know, a lot of the January the 6th participants in the riots at the Capitol bragged about themselves on social media, and as a consequence were identified and arrested. Over 500 people arrested. My view is that these people will have learned the dangers of communicating too openly on social media, and what you're going to find is your encrypted channels like Telegram becoming more and more popular, which is a form of social media in itself. So that's what I see is likely to happen.
Okay, Martha, thank you so much for that. Look, we did have some other questions up on the screen, but unfortunately, very unfortunately, so we could have gone for at least another hour, I think, discussing these issues. We are out of time. So I would like to thank you again for, let me make the pun, truly inspiring.
You are so welcome. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed thinking this through. I enjoyed the questions. And if anybody wants to send me an email question, feel free.
Terrific. Thank you again. We are going to pause in one moment, just again to allow the recording to reset. And then immediately after that, we're going to swing into our next session, Shaken and Stirred, COVID and Violent Extremism. So we'll just have that one minute pause for the recording and see you in a moment.